Naushad Saab, thank you for inviting me and having me on your show.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir, for sharing your perspective.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Pleasure to have you in our show.
Shah, thank you for inviting me for this conversation.
Thank you.
Welcome, sir, to our next episode of Expert Insight.
Thank you very much indeed.
Hello, good evening, and a very warm welcome. For our next face-to-face, I have with me our guest, Amir Ali, who teaches at the Center for Political Studies, JNU. He is also taught at the Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia, and he was Agatha Harrison Memorial Visiting Fellow at St. Anthony College, Oxford, between 2012 and 2014. He has also authored 2 books and is a regular writer of political commentary with a special focus on global politics. Welcome to our next episode of Expert Insights. Pleasure to have you in our show.
Thank you so much.
Let's jump to our conversation directly. In recent months, we have seen Howard and several other major universities in the US have come under intensive scrutiny over academic freedom, and they are facing enormous challenges. So to begin with, what are your thoughts on the recent controversies surrounding academic freedom at Harvard and beyond, and what do you think is at stake here?
Well, there are, I think, 2 important issues to look at in this whole thing. Firstly, the wholesale attack on some of the US's most prized institutions, famous across the world, very coveted institutions, youngsters wanting to go there. I think it's reflective of 2 things. Firstly, it's the authoritarian impulse, and by the authoritarian impulse, I mean Donald Trump's impulse, to crack down on any centers of intellectualism. And I think this is a manifestation of his own anti-intellectualism. So generally speaking, the authoritarian impulse, it reflects this anti-intellectualism. So any centers of excellence of the kind that Harvard and Columbia and other such Ivy League colleges represent are to be undermined, to be downgraded, to be there's a wholesale attack, which, as I said, arises from what I'm calling the authoritarian impulse. It's part of this larger agenda of anti-intellectualism, of this idea that people who go to these places are no good. But that's one aspect of it. But the flip side of it has more to do with these institutions and they're becoming overly exclusive. These are bastions of elitism. And because they are bastions of elitism, entry into these institutions has meant an entry into a certain kind of a larger elite, a global elite. And I think that when it comes to this aspect of Harvard and Columbia and these other places, the fault lies more with them rather than the Trump administration's crackdown. So the Trump administration's crackdown is, of course, deplorable. There is no doubt about that. These are, with all their limitations, these are very significant and worthy centers of education and excellence. But then the way that they have created themselves as bastions of elitism, they are extremely expensive to go to. And to that extent, I think that they may have met what in English is called their comeuppance, that a certain fate that was coming to them. Because what these institutions, most of them being private institutions, have done is that they have created higher education into a commodity, something that is bought and sold. Yeah. Whereas I've always believed that higher education should be something which it is a public good and should remain a public good. Now, a public good means a good that is available to the wider public, and it leads to a certain kind of improvement of the wider public. Now, when education stops being a public good and becomes a commodity, as these universities are responsible for making it, then I think that this is a disservice to the cause of education itself. I often quote this book by the famous American economist Thorstein Veblen. He's more famous for his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. But there's this other book that is written which is called The Higher Education in America. And in this book, he warns that education should never be run by captains of industry who will make it into a commodity, as these universities are responsible for making it into a commodity. So I think this second aspect has not really got the kind of attention that it really should have got. So as I said, my response to your question was in 2 parts. The first part, of course, the very atrocious attack on higher education, which of course is wrong and deplorable. But at the same time, these universities themselves are responsible not for bringing this upon themselves, but for creating them in these universities into bastions not of the public good, but for elitism. When I think of many Indian students, for example, who go to these universities, or for that matter, many students from across the world who are drawn to these universities, talented youngsters go there. I realize that what is happening to these students is that they are buying places into elitism, a kind of a global network of elitism. Now, this global network of elitism, to my mind, exists at the expense of a larger public good, and I don't think universities should perform this kind of a role. They should remain institutions whereby a larger public enlightenment happens. And I'm not saying that they haven't done that. I mean, many famous Harvard faculty members and Columbia faculty members have done that. But what I'm trying to suggest is that the larger system in which the systemic manner in which these universities have been crafted is to become these bastions of exclusivity and elitism. So I'll give you one more example of what I mean. Someone once commented recently on Columbia that it's actually not a university, but it's a hedge fund management enterprise. It's a real estate enterprise to which a university has been added as an afterthought. So the business aspects of these universities tend to predominate over the educational aspects, and that is to the detriment of higher education. And I think that to that extent, they have they have reduced the efficacy with which they have been able to respond to Mr. Trump's attacks.
That's really thought-provoking, and it brings me to the larger concern which I have right now. So how can university, especially elite institutions like Harvard, safeguard themselves from political interference? I mean, when there's external pressure from politicians, donors, or even public opinion, how can independence and integrity in academia be preserved? And what can universities all around the world can do about it?
Well, autonomy is a principle that is enshrined in higher education. An institution cannot function without autonomy. Now we see the way that academic autonomy is being curtailed and being infiltrated and encroached upon in our own country. So it's not something that is just happening in America or in India. I think this is a larger realization upon the path of authoritarian regimes that higher education centers are centers of dissent, and that the purposeful, meaningful activity that goes on is a threat to authoritarian regimes that do not want to be questioned. So I would stress the principle of autonomy itself as something which is significant. Now, what does autonomy mean? Quite often I think that it is used more as a catchphrase rather than being able to explain anything more meaningful. Now, one of the biggest threats to autonomy is funding, for example. So a lot of these universities, especially in the West, and we are going down that model as well. I mean, the private universities that we see proliferating in India are following a model which I do not think really should be followed. So I think one of the biggest threats comes from donors, because the old English saying is that he who calls the piper calls the tune. So therefore, the biggest threat to education comes from the people who fund from them. Which means, again, I go back to the argument about the public good that I was making in the previous, in response to your previous question. When I suggest that education is a public good, what that means is that this is a good that is publicly provisioned through the exchequer, through state expenditure. Now, when it is publicly provisioned through state expenditure, that means that there's a certain kind of a democratic element built into it. Whereas if private funding predominates, as it does in many universities across the world and increasingly in India right now, there is a very real threat to autonomy itself. So that, I think, would be the first threat to autonomy: the provisioning of not public funding, but private donors, and alumni and endowments and all of that. The second thing about autonomy that I would say, and I say this with a lot of sadness as an academic, is that I notice a complete lack of self-respect amongst academics today in the way in which they bow and kowtow to the powers that be. This is not the way that academia should be. The academia has a certain kind of a self-respect. Without that self-respect, I don't think autonomy can flourish at all. So I'm quite often very surprised to see people eager for political positions, for political sinecures. I think that becomes the reason why you have this kind of a lack of autonomy. There are all kinds of interferences these days when it comes to appointments. So people of a certain political persuasion get political appointments. This is the complaint right now in India. In America, the complaint has been that it's always been the liberal left that gets academic appointments. So this is a complaint that comes from the right wing. So I think that when it comes to autonomy, there are two aspects to autonomy. One, the self-respect that academics must cultivate in their own enterprise. And I feel very sad to say this, that I have noticed a gradual evisceration of this self-respect, which means that academics do not realize the importance of the work that they are doing. So those two aspects of autonomy, I think, are important. When it comes to appointments, I think that universities must be left to themselves in terms of who they want to recruit as faculty members. Any form of outside interference would be a gross undermining of this autonomy itself. So yes, I think that the term autonomy is a term that is it's used very often without people realizing what exactly it means. I think it's important to go back to the history of the university and the way that universities have grown as these almost guild-like entities where a particular kind of scholarly craftsmanship took place. The biggest threat, as I said, was when public funding was slowly curtailed, which made universities increasingly move towards industry. And I think that that particular process, once it starts kicking in, is a process that tends to undermine the possibility of autonomy itself. So I would urge academics to really think about what exactly they mean by autonomy. It also means the sanctity of the classroom, which means that in a classroom, an academic must be free to teach whatever he or she wants to teach. There should be absolutely no element of surveillance or snooping or curtailing. So when it comes to the question of free speech, which we are talking about across the world right now, one of the very important aspects of free speech actually begins with the classroom itself. The classroom must remain that sacrosanct, almost sacred domain, where the academic, the lecturer, must be able to allow his thought processes to go unhindered. They must flow unhindered. And sadly, that doesn't happen these days. Also, questions that are raised must be answered in the classroom. Unfortunately, in universities in India especially, the classroom has become this space of imparting knowledge, is dispensing it as if it's a medicine or something of that kind. Whereas knowledge actually emerges from a free flow of ideas when a dialogue happens, when students are provoked into thinking. You cannot have all of this if there is a certain kind of restriction on thinking itself. So free speech in many ways has a very, very important intimate connection with the what I call the sanctity of the classroom. So there's that element of autonomy in the classroom, and of course there is appointments, and then of course what universities want to teach in terms of the curricula they draw up. There should not be any outside interference in terms of this. Let me also make one more point, which is about accountability, and this would link up to the point that I was making earlier. What I have noticed, especially amongst the universities in the West, is that they have become increasingly cloistered concerns. That they do not really seem to have any wider connection to the world. This is happening because of a certain kind of a cloistering of academia. And I think that this is wrong. And at the same time, with the 5 decades of neoliberalism that we have witnessed, there has increasingly been the idea that the marketplace should dictate what courses universities teach. So STEM disciplines, for example, science, technology, engineering, management disciplines, have increasingly proliferated over the last few years. So the incursion of the market was also, to my mind, be a very significant curtailment of the idea of autonomy itself. Academia is not something that can be subject to the vagaries of market forces of demand and supply. And I've been strongly against that. Unfortunately, that is the road that universities are going down. So just to give you a sense of this, many universities in the West now prefer to have not vice chancellors, but chief executive officers, which I think is a very unfortunate development, because if every institution in life, like the university, is made to copy the corporation, that would be a travesty for education itself. Universities must not be made to answer what is called the bottom line. They should not become instruments of profit and loss. So yeah, those are all the reasons why autonomy is being curtailed in the way that it is right now.
Right. The tension between institutional autonomy and external accountability seems to be growing. Speaking of politics, the Trump administration's approach to higher education drew global attention. So what are broader implications of those actions on academic freedom, and just how dangerous is this trend for the overall education temperament in the United States and elsewhere?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, because we know that the US for the last 80 years has become this beacon of drawing young people from across the world. Um, Young people are drawn to these fine universities, Harvard, Columbia on the East Coast, Princeton, of course, on the East Coast. Then on the West Coast, you have Stanford and Berkeley, and in the Midwest, there's some very famous campuses, Michigan, Chicago, all these places. So right now, what is happening is that I mean, one reason why this crisis is happening is because these universities became places that sold their seats. So much money was paid to get into these institutions, and both the US and the UK, for that matter. UK is also a country with a very strong university system, which I think is being undermined right now. So I think the big mistake that was made by these countries was to sell their universities and higher education sector as a service, which would be consumed by youngsters not just from their own countries but from across the world. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges. Now, the Trump challenge comes much later. The Trump challenge has come after this particular road has been traversed, this particular road of making higher education into a service that is to be sold. I think it's very important for universities to go back to the idea of education as a public good that is not bought and sold, that is not subject to market forces, that is not subject to the forces of supply and demand. And the fact that these universities have gone down this particular road of selling higher education as a service has made them less equipped to handle the Trump challenge. I hope I've been able to make this point very clearly. So the Trump challenge is something that has happened only recently in this second presidency, opening month of the second presidency. But I think the ability of these institutions to actually be able to respond effectively, and I'm not saying that they have not responded, but all that I'm saying is that the ability to respond effectively has been undermined by this particular crafting of higher education as something which is a service. Also, I think the big danger of someone like Mr. Trump is his crude and crass anti-intellectualism. Any society must have a certain degree of intellectualism, and I think because of this requirement that societies have, universities must, I'm not saying that every faculty member has to become a public intellectual, but I am saying that public intellectualism is something which is very, very important. It is very important because the public intellectual has the ability to be able to communicate complex ideas to societies. And I think increasingly with the onset of what I'm calling the transformation of higher education into a service to be bought and sold, this ability of universities to create public intellectuals has become undermined and compromised. And therefore, what happens is that there's a disconnect between the university and society, because I'm thinking of the public intellectual as the person who can bridge this disconnect or divide. I always have been of the opinion that universities will be repositories of very rarefied thinking, very difficult, technical, complex ideas like theoretical physics, for example, will be taught in universities. Or if you are in the social sciences, aspects of political theory, which I teach, for example, or history. Now, of course, most people in society will not have time to be able to understand the intricacies of this, and therefore the role of the public intellectual becomes very important to be able to communicate these complex ideas to society. So there have been some great scientists, for example, Carl Sagan, for instance, who was able to, through his popular programs, communicate scientific ideas and thereby enhance the scientific temperament in society, as we call it. And as universities have become more exclusivist bastions, as US universities have become, the ability to communicate these complex ideas to the general public has gone down. And therefore, I always think that there must be this ability on the part of intellectuals, public university intellectuals, to be able to communicate ideas, to write in the newspapers, to write in general interest magazines. Let me add one more thing that has happened with the university, and I think this is also very sad. And this is the kind of excessive emphasis that is given on publication, in especially the US university. The term publish or perish actually comes from US academia. Now, as a result of this excessive focus, almost a certain kind of what I can only call a certain kind of paranoia with publishing. What academics have been reduced to is to churn out research papers every year. So most university academics, because they have become so careerist, have only focused on their publications in select journals. As a result of which, the wider dissemination of ideas that universities should be all about is not happening. So I've always been against the idea of publish or perish, and this is something that American universities have especially fostered. Unfortunately, it has spread, like many other bad things that the US exports to other parts of the world. It has spread to other countries, and as a result of which, young academics especially are always caught up in this anxiety, on this excessive concern that they must keep publishing. So it's almost like being on a treadmill, this kind of an academic publishing treadmill. As a result of which, there is an inability on the part of people to be able to communicate these ideas to the wider public. This is a great loss, because I've always felt that universities should contribute to a certain kind of a larger public enlightenment, a certain enhancement of the public discourse. If you look at societies across the world right now, it is very, very sad to see the very low levels of public discourse right now. I mean, in India, for example, the Godi media has certainly contributed to very, very low levels of public intellectual discourse. It's hardly intellectual. The same is the case, for example, in the UK. The tabloid press in that country was owned predominantly by the media baron Rupert Murdoch, contributed to this kind of a very simplistic understanding, and not just a simplistic, but almost a stupid understanding of complex issues. In America, similarly, Fox News and these other media outlets. Now, I think that this space that these media outlets occupied is to do with the way in which the universities themselves abdicated this very, very important responsibility that they had of communicating ideas to the public, and by communicating ideas, by doing so, to enhance the general level of intellectual discourse. Now, it's very sad to see the way that very complex issues across the world are discussed in media circles, almost like trivializing it, and making it into something which is very, very not just anti-intellectual, but also very unintelligent.
It appears to be a very dangerous scenario. And if we think beyond US, what do you think are the most significant challenges to academic freedom today, and what is the way forward?
Well, it's difficult to think about a way forward, because the world is in such a bad shape right now. I mean, I look at the world right now, and this is something I tell my students is pretty. I pick up the newspaper and I feel that today is worse than yesterday. So I don't know. I think the biggest challenge is for the university to be able to kind of redefine its role, to find meaning. I think what has happened is that the meaning of a university education has become significantly undermined, because a lot of young people don't really know why they are going to university. Universities have become these places where young people spend a few years of their lives, undergraduate degrees and all that, and there's a kind of a general lack of direction. You will remember, Naushad bhai, when we were in Aligarh, and the vice chancellor was a man called Naseem Farooq. I mean, he was a good vice chancellor. I'm not saying that he wasn't a good vice chancellor, but there was this excessive in the 1990s, this excessive focus on professional courses, engineering, management. Now, I don't want to undermine the significance of management and medicine and engineering. But at the same time, I do want to stress the fact that any university must have a very significant component of general courses to it. I mean, a university cannot just all the time churn out people who are employable. Employability, yes, it is an important part of education. But if a university were to exclusively focus on how employable its graduates are, then what will happen is that it will end up teaching them skills that will become obsolete by the time they enter the marketplace, the job market. So when I go back to the 1990s, I think this was the great mistake that was made and I'm sure you remember this, as we were together at AMU. And I often felt, as both of us students of the social sciences, I often felt that this was highly problematic. I mean, it's very important for university to have a very significant history department, an economics department, an English department, languages, Urdu department, Hindi department. These are the departments, the social sciences and the humanities, that contribute to the university being an enlightened space, where a particular kind of ideas, Nehru's term, which is, it's written all across JNU where I teach. It says that the university is an adventure of ideas. Young people, I think when they go to university, must be intoxicated by these ideas. They must be able to talk about intellectual trends. This is the place for young people to come and talk about these things. And I think that that aspect of university has been undermined. The excitement of being university, in terms of being intoxicated by ideas, I think has completely gone. Um, Also, I think, and this again has to do with the way in which the U.S. university has developed. That what the US has done is that it has sucked talent from across the world. I mean, you'll notice that every year we have this phenomenon of the brain drain, where our brightest students go to the best universities in the US. And I think by when the US draws the best and brightest students, and it's not just the US, of course, there's the UK, there's Europe. Increasingly, students seem to want to go to Australia. I think what is happening is that we are creating a set of youngsters who are drawn to a particular dream of first world living, the glamour, the glitz of the Western University. And when they are drawn to this glamour and glitz of the Western University, they want to continue living that dream. Now, this is so let me use a term in English, which actually I think comes from, I think this is a Persian term, janissaries. What we are creating, I mean, the crisis of the university is that the first world universities in England and America and England and in Europe, they are drawing young people as janissaries. Janissaries were these young boys of the Christian territories of the Ottoman Empire, who at age around 11, 12 were indoctrinated to give up their lives for the Ottoman Empire. And I think something akin to that has happened, where a certain soft power of the first world is perpetuated by through the youngsters who are drawn to this. Now, I don't want to suggest that it's all doom and gloom in Western universities. I mean, these universities have had the courage of young people standing up and protesting for Palestine. It was heartening to see students in Columbia, in Harvard, really come out and protest. But what I'm indicating is a larger systemic problem. The systemic problem of the university acting in this way of drawing talent to the first world, and by drawing talent, making many of these youngsters into what I'm referring to as academic janissaries, because they're so career driven. So to go back to your question about the challenge, I think the challenge of higher education is that when universities become overly oriented towards narrow careerism, okay, that becomes a problem. Now, so let me just focus on what I mean by narrow careerism. The idea of narrow careerism means that young people are, and not just young people, even people who are in their middle ages, they're only thinking about their careers. They have their career blinkers on. घोड़ों को ऐसे blinkers रहते हैं ना, तो ये जो narrow careerism क्या करता है ना, कि एक careers blinker लगा देता है इंसान पर. वो सिर्फ अपने career का रास्ता ही देख पाता है. It's not able to take a wider view. Now, higher education is meant to broaden horizons. It is not meant to put blinkers on. So in a lot of conversations I've had with people, I have invoked the idea of I think the Dutch historian Rutger Bregman, who talks about moral ambition. And I think universities must be able to bring back moral ambition. The idea that when young people come to university, they will then be able to leave the portals of the university and enter society and be able to contribute to a larger enlightenment of those societies. So the fact that this is not happening, the fact that universities have made young people into very narrow, blinkered, career-driven people, I think is the crisis of the university, and this must be addressed and rethought.
Yes, and that leads to the student, because ultimately they are the heartbeat of any academic institutions. Absolutely. And therefore, what role does academic freedom play in nurturing critical thinking, creativity, and innovation in a student? And do you think these values are under threat in today's polarized world?
I think so, yes. I think they are very much under threat because, remember, the student is a very vulnerable entity. Yeah. The student is vulnerable because this is a young person starting out in life, whose prospects, life prospects, career prospects are not clear at all. So I think that quite often what authoritarian regimes and generally the market society that we are so much a part of does is that it preys upon the vulnerability of the student. And I think that is something that has to be guarded against. So just to give you an example of this, when many students protested against Israeli actions in Gaza, what they were threatened with was, their jobs, their careers, their prospects. So the vulnerability of the student, I think, must never be preyed upon. On the other hand, the vulnerability of the student must be protected and must be eliminated. So I think the university must be designed in such a way that it becomes much, much more student friendly. Now, unfortunately, what I've witnessed in the last last 4 decades or so, I mean, I've been teaching university for now 20 years now. I've noticed that increasingly the universities do not cater to students, that they have become these dispensers of service, dispensers of degrees, and that enhances the vulnerability of the student. So his parents, her parents will tell the student, कि जाओ पढ़ाई करो, don't engage in any other activity. That's wrong. And the university should be a life transforming experience. And if a student is always driven towards just thinking about careers, it will not make him or her into a well-rounded personality. Movies like Three Idiots, for example, captured this aspect. And अफसोस की बात है कि भारत में सब लोग movies देख लेते हैं, never seem to understand the message behind many of these movies. I mean, that was a movie with a very significant message.
Don't carry forward the message that is given there.
Sorry?
They don't carry forward the message what is given there.
No. People watch the movie 3 hours, बहुत अच्छी movie थी, बहुत अच्छी acting, and then they forget everything about it. That aspect. At the same time, the point that you made in your question, which I think was a very good point, which is that the student is perhaps the center of the university.
Yeah.
I've always felt that faculty members, of course, will be there for a long time. I mean, the average academic career is what, 25, 30 years. Yeah. That's a long time for any person to be a faculty member. But rather than focus on this long, drawn-out presence, it is more important to focus on the pulsating presence of the student. I'm using this term deliberately, pulsating presence. Just as the blood flows through the arteries in a pulsating manner. I think the student, his passage through the university is a pulsating passage. There's a certain kind of a lively, throbbing, exciting element to this. And if the vulnerability of the student is preyed upon, as I said, that element of what I call the pulsating presence of the student will simply vanish, and it will be the death of the university. And I think that most universities, especially in India, I would say this, that most of our universities have died. Now, when a university dies, that doesn't mean it's not there anymore. All it means is that the university has become a shell of itself. There's no life left within it. So you look at the great university, you go to Aligarh Muslim University, you still find great buildings. But what actually happens inside those buildings is more important. Are there lively lectures going on? Are there lively seminars going on? So I think this is a point that Satish Deshpande made once, that the death of the university doesn't mean that there is no university anymore. All it means is that the rigmarole, the routine activity of the university continues. Exams will go on happening, classes will happen in a very desultory fashion. The academic calendar will be pursued, but there's no spirit behind those activities. I have seen with my own eyes my own university, JNU, dying in front of me right now. I mean, it used to be a pretty good university at one time, and I am shocked to see the way in which it is declining. Same happened with AMU. This is true of all our universities. I mean, Allahabad at one time was called the Oxford of the East. You look at places like Oxford, they have been around for 800 years. And I often feel that the lifespan of the modern Indian university is not more than 50, 60, 70, 80 years. This is really something that we must think about. Also, because I indicated this when I responded to your first question, the rise of the private university, I think, is extremely detrimental to the system of the higher education sector as a whole. Because what the new private universities, the Ashokas and the OP Jindals have done, is that they have often drawn very bright faculty members from the public universities. And also what has happened is what I can only call the secession of the rich. Rich parents do not send their children to public universities anymore. They prefer to spend 9 lakh rupees or 10 lakh rupees sending them to Ashoka. As a result of which the university no longer is a class mixing institution. One of the great adventures of university life was the fact that it was a class mixing institution. You had people from very different kinds of backgrounds coming together. Just to kind of round off this point, because your question has provoked me to think about many, many things. I think what has happened is that the Indian elite has used the top public universities like JNU, like AMU, as these ladders, these careerless ladders they have climbed on. And once they've climbed onto these ladders and got to significant, powerful positions, they've kicked the ladder away. And this is a term that the South Korean economist Hu Jung-cha uses, kicking the ladder away. Yeah. And I think this activity of kicking the ladder away is a particularly cruel activity, because what the Indian elite has done is that it itself has used the public university to climb the ladder to important positions. And then, just said, okay, by kicking the ladder away, they want to retain their elite exclusivist positions. So to make a connection between the first point and this point that I'm making, in response to your first question, anytime the university becomes a bastion of elitist exclusivity, that will become the death of the university. Now, this is not to deny that the universities do not create elites. Of course, they create elites. There cannot be any society without an elite. But the question is, what kind of elites do we create? Do we create elites that don't just serve their own interests, but are able to further the interests of society as a whole? I would always argue that the latter kind of elites, the elites that don't just serve their own interests, but are actually able to contribute to a larger public good, would be the kind of elitism that public universities should be promoting. And when I look at JNU right now, I feel that at some time it did come alive, but precisely the moment that it was about to come alive, it has been eliminated in its ability to really contribute to education as a public good in India.
Finally, one last quick question. What gives you hope despite all these challenges? Where do you see signs of resilience coming out from the campuses or the administration of those campuses?
Not the administration, certainly. It cannot come. I don't see hope even from faculty members. But I do see hope among students because, of course, this is not true of our own country. But let me take the example of Columbia University. A very prominent faculty member, Rashid Khalidi, he's famous historian, author of the 100 Years War in Palestine, recently retired from Columbia. And he addressed students outside Columbia University, the students who were protesting against Israeli actions in Gaza. And the point that he made was that he told the students that you're on the right side of history. And I often feel that the administrations of universities are always on the wrong side of history, and that students, for whatever reasons which I really can't explain, tend to be on the right side of history. So what gives me hope is the ability of young people to be able to discern what is the right side of history. Now, it's unfortunate that the right side of history quite often tends to be the side of the bread that is not buttered. That saying that we have, that some people know which side of the bread is buttered. That means that they know their own advantage. So I see hope there. These campus protests that we have witnessed in the last year and a half, I think are bigger than the anti-Vietnam War protests that happened in the 60s and 70s. I think that this will have a very significant knock-on effect in the world. Despite how bad things may be in the world right now, what is happening in the Middle East, Israeli actions, attack on Iran, and the military actions that both countries are carrying out against each other. These are bleak times. So there's this novel by a Palestinian author whose name I forget right now. It's called The Pessimist. And I think that I am a pessimist when it comes to the very pessimistic state of universities. But despite the pessimistic state of universities, I find optimism amongst young people. Now, I'm not saying this to appease my students or to somehow flatter them, but I'm just saying that there is a certain kind of a youthful optimism that I find amongst especially young people. And I say this especially as people like you and me get older and find some kind of a hope amongst younger people. But I think that the old saying that hope springs eternal is something that we have to kind of really latch onto. And therefore, amongst young people, I think that there will arise the ability to discern what is right and what is wrong, what is the right side of history. And as I said, it's very unfortunate, or perhaps this is the big challenge, that quite often the right side of history tends to be the side of the bread that is not buttered. I think that ability and the kind of skill that is required to negotiate these difficulties is what will lead us to move beyond the kind of very dark times that we are living through. I don't think in the last 100 years since the Second World War ended have we witnessed such dark times. Given the kind of escalation of conflicts across the world, this is really the time for universities to be bastions of understanding what exactly is going on. So yeah, I think that is where I find hope and optimism amongst my students when I teach them. Every time for example, I teach, if I see that a point that I've made is somehow creating a sparkle in an eye, or if one person starts smiling and says, "Oh, I can understand that," that gives me hope. And I think it's with those little bits of hope that we have to go on living and creating a future, despite all the darkness around us.
Okay, thanks for sharing your perspective. We'll be back next time with another expert. Thanks for watching. Take care. Keep your environment clean. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.